Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Midday Science Cafe Alchemy in the 21st Century, New Materials to Combat the Energy Crisis. Welcome, everyone. We're excited to have you right before school starts, or for some of you, maybe school has already started. So I hope it's going well, everyone's first days of schools. All right, we always start with a land acknowledgement. We recognize that Berkeley sits on the Hu-Chun territory, the ancestral and unceded land of the Ohlone people, the successors of the historic and sovereign Verona Band of Alameda County. This land was and continues to be of great importance to the Ohlone tribe and other familial descendants of the Verona Band. Every member of the Berkeley community has and continues to benefit from the use and occupation of this land since the institution's founding in 1868. By offering this land acknowledgement, the Berkeley community not only recognizes the history of the land on which we stand, but also recognizes that the Ohlone people are alive and flourishing members of the Berkeley and broader Bay Area communities today. Again, thank you for allowing me to give that land acknowledgement. I just want to add that we have a lot of amazing programming coming up. Our September Midday Science Cafe is on astronomy. We have a lecture in October all about animals and the road to electrification in November. So we have a great lineup coming up in the fall. So as I said, I'm not sure if I said, but I'm going to say I'm the director of Science at Cal. I hope some of you have joined us before, but just to give you a little bit of an introduction of what Science at Cal is. In 2008, Science at Cal was envisioned as a unifying effort to raise public awareness, understanding, and appreciation of scientific research at UC Berkeley. To realize this vision, we engaged the vast Berkeley science, technology, engineering, and mathematics communities that STEM to foster creative collaboration among campus and community-based groups who share our commitment to equity and inclusion in STEM education and STEM careers. Science at Cal connects researchers with diverse community groups of all ages and backgrounds for science engagement and learning. Accessibility, inclusiveness, creativity, and innovations are all hallmarks of Science at Cal events, which reach tens of thousands of people annually. Throughout the year, we present ongoing free outreach programs on and off campus. We help promote related efforts across campus and in the community, and we create new initiatives and programs at Berkeley and in the community. And our broad scope of activities is made possible by Science at Cal's dynamic network of campus and off-campus partnerships and community members, including Berkeley Lab. Before I introduce Berkeley Lab, and I just wanted to let you know a few things. One, this presentation is being recorded, so no worries if you have to leave early, or if you love it so much you want to share it with friends. We'll be providing everyone who RSVP today links to this on YouTube. We also want to mention that this is being closed captioned, so go ahead. There's settings in Zoom which allow you to read live transcripts. And the last thing I wanted to say is that we are very active on Q&A and on the chat. So if you'd like to ask our presenters questions, please, we encourage you to do that. There's two ways to do that. Again, either in the chat or in the QA. Pick whichever you want. You don't need to do them both, but we encourage you to be asking questions throughout the entire presentation, and we'll do really big and broad Q&A sessions after the presentations. So with that, I am going to hand things over to Jen Tang from Berkeley Lab.
Thanks so much, Dee. And hello, folks. I've been looking at the chat. It seems like we've got an international audience today, which is awesome. So thanks everybody for joining us. I am the Director of Community Relations at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. And for those who aren't familiar with us, Berkeley Lab is one of 17 US Department of Energy national laboratories across the country. We are supported by the Department of Energy's Office of Science, and we're managed by the University of California. All of the research we conduct is unclassified. And since our founding way back in 1931 by UC Berkeley physics professor named Ernest Orlando Lawrence, we've been dedicated to advancing the scope of human knowledge and seeking answers to some of the greatest problems facing humankind. Today, Berkeley Lab employees work together to develop meaningful scientific solutions to the world's most intractable energy and environmental challenges, We help train the next generation of scientists and engineers, and we ensure that those things happen in a manner that benefits everyone. Our main campus is located in the Berkeley Hills, and our close ties to the UC system create a really unique and synergistic environment for scientific discovery. A number of the lab's researchers are affiliated with one of the UC campuses, either as students, postdocs, or professors who have joint appointments at the lab. And we're fortunate to have a really close relationship with UC Berkeley, and our institutions have joined forces to advance science across a number of different frontiers. In fact, one of the main motivations for creating our Midday Science Cafe series is to share with you examples of compelling and complementary research from both our institutions. And we hope that you enjoy today's presentation on material science. So I am pleased to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Matt Horton. Matt is a materials scientist at Berkeley Lab, where he currently helps lead the Materials Project, which is an open access resource that's used by hundreds of thousands of materials scientists worldwide. And you'll learn a little bit more about the Materials Project at Matt's talk. Matt comes to us from Wales in the UK, and he studied at the University of Cambridge and Imperial College London before he moved to California. His research interests include all aspects of crystallography and how it intersects with big data, and is especially focused on how to make material science data and algorithms as understandable and accessible to as broad a range of scientists as possible. The dream of Matt's research is to help people develop a new understanding of material science, and in the process, contribute to new ways of designing materials to enable a positive and sustainable future. So Matt, over to you.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I'm very, very happy to be here today and to be able to talk to you all. So I'm just going to share my slides and make sure that everybody can see them.
They look great.
Thank you so much. Okay, so the title of my talk today is Alchemy in the 21st Century, New Materials to Combat the Energy Crisis. So just to talk you through what I'm going to be presenting, I'm going to start with a problem statement, and then we're going to learn a little bit about crystals, what they are, and how they form. Then I'm going to talk about how we study crystal structures in the laboratory, and also how computers can help with that, and how together they can give us new tools to find new clean energy solutions. And this will segue nicely to our next speaker, who will be talking about solar panels and giving a talk, Journey to the Center of a Solar Panel, from Dr. Rachel Woods-Robinson. Okay. So to begin, this image is from an Indian artist, Raja Nandipu, showing an optimistic vision for the future, just one idea of what the future might look like. It's green in harmony with nature, with clean energy solutions. Unfortunately, we know that we have problems. The IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, a UN organization, produces these reports that give the general public and policymakers, politicians, facts about climate change. All the facts in these reports are agreed upon by all 195 participating countries. The data in these reports is very uncontroversial. And it gives a clear message that the climate is in trouble. There is no single solution, but we know that scientists across subjects all have different roles to play, and that maybe together we can start to undo some of the damage that we've done to this planet. So what is the role of a materials scientist in combating climate change? Well, materials scientists study materials. What is a material? It can be many different things, but many materials are crystal structures, crystals. If I asked you to draw a crystal, what would you draw? Maybe you would draw something like this. This is exactly correct. These are all crystals, gemstones, things that you might see in jewelry, things that you can dig up from the ground. But what maybe is not immediately apparent is that crystals are actually absolutely everywhere. There are not just minerals in the earth, there are minerals in the human body, for example, in our ear, in our teeth, in our bones. There are minerals in nature everywhere we look, in ice, in snow, that give us this beautiful symmetrical structure of a snowflake. There are crystal structures that we make, artificial crystals that do not exist in nature at all, that we've made in the lab. There are crystals in food, not just table salt, but in cheese and chocolate. Actually, many different types of crystal in chocolate. It's part of what makes making it so difficult. There are also crystals in metals. Sometimes if you look really closely at a metal, this is an image of a bronze bell from an old piece of clockwork. We'll see that actually all metals are lots of small crystal structures smushed together. We call these polycrystals. So really crystals are everywhere. This is another metal, bismuth. It turns out that crystals are kind of a lot like people. Nature and nurture plays a role. So they form not just based on the chemistry of what's inside them, but they're also a product of their environment, and many different crystals are possible. So if you can see me right now, this is bismuth, just as a pure metal, forming this beautiful hopper crystal of little cubic steps. But when you put bismuth in an oxygenated atmosphere, just on Earth, we will see beautiful, beautiful layers of a second crystal forming on top of the bismuth, giving this beautiful iridescence of bismuth oxide. So this isn't an artificial coloring to this crystal. This is just something that forms naturally because of the oxygen in its environment. And excuse me while I just turn off my my microscope. And crystals are also useful. So they're in a lot of things already that we manufacture, like LED light bulbs, solar cells, lasers, batteries. There are so many applications of crystals that really anywhere you look, there is going to be a crystal playing a role somewhere in that solution. So if we start to think about the atomic scale of what's really inside these crystals, we will see that a crystal is really a pattern of atoms that repeats on and on and on and on until eventually, you hit the surface of the crystal. But for practical purposes, when we as scientists think of crystals, we really think of them as this infinite pattern of atoms like we see here. Because this pattern is infinite, as scientists, we usually draw the smallest repeating pattern to represent the larger crystal. If you've ever seen something like this, this is a ball and stick model, which was invented by Hofmann in the 19th century. Turns out that representing atoms as balls and sticks is actually a very, very useful representation. And we can learn lots of profound things about a crystal just from this very simplistic picture. But if you ever see something like this, just remember that this is just one part of a much larger, infinite crystal structure. So why do atoms like to form crystals? Well, atoms are a friendly bunch. They do like to bond to other atoms. Importantly, if you have similar atoms together, they like to bond in the same way. And this is what allows these patterns to form. And as patterns grow larger and larger and larger, they eventually form the crystal that I was showing earlier. So for the next part of my talk, I just want to talk a little bit about how we know this. It's not obvious, maybe, where the atoms are inside a crystal structure, just because we can see a crystal structure on a macroscopic scale, meaning we can hold it in our hands. That doesn't mean we know where the atoms are inside it. Not even the most powerful magnifying glass will be able to show you those atoms. So we need other tools to be able to see inside crystal structures. So this is an analogy I just want to give you a general idea of how this works. So imagine there are some islands in an ocean, and all of a sudden, maybe you're in San Francisco, the fog rolls in, you can't see the islands anymore. What evidence would you have that the islands are still there if you can't see them? Well, we can use waves. So if you imagine you're on a boat just behind those islands, and you could measure the height of the waves, you would see that there are lots of waves in the gap between the islands and very few waves immediately behind them. And this is kind of a process called diffraction. And using diffraction, we have evidence now that those islands are there. And this works because the size of the waves is similar to the size of the islands. You could imagine if the waves were huge, they would just go right over the top of the island. We wouldn't have the evidence we need anymore. So if we start now to think, instead of islands, we're thinking about atoms, and instead of ocean waves, we're thinking about light waves instead. We need waves that are spaced similarly to the spacing between atoms in a crystal. So how far apart are these atoms? Maybe about a billionth of an inch. Or if you use meters, it's about 10 to the power of minus 10 meters. So very, very small. Turns out that the waves of an X-ray are really ideal for this and can give us the evidence we need about where atoms are in a crystal. So just to illustrate this idea, imagine an experimental setup like this. We have a little crystal structure, an X-ray comes in, and then a pattern comes out that we can look at and we can record. So this is just an illustration. This is a photo of a laser, but similar principles apply with X-rays. So our job is then to go backwards from the pattern that we see on the right, the diffraction pattern, to figure out where the atoms are inside the crystal structure. This is a photo of the original X-ray diffractometer. It was a beautiful piece of equipment that really started this whole field. And I haven't got time to talk to you today about how it works, but this was invented by a father-son team, Lawrence and William Bragg, and it really kick-started this whole field of X-ray crystallography. So that was what it looked like about 100 years ago. What does it look like today? Well, we have different tools today. If you are in Berkeley or in the East Bay and you look up in the Berkeley Hills, you might have seen this big domed building. This is called the Advanced Light Source. This building, the whole building produces X-rays that are 1 billion times brighter than the light we get from the sun. These X-rays now give us the most high quality picture we've ever been able to have inside the structure of crystals. This building is shaped as it is for a reason. There's a big donut-shaped structure inside where electrons travel around at close to the speed of light. And they then are able to give off X-rays, which scientists from all over the world who travel to Berkeley shine into their crystal structures to record these diffraction patterns. It's actually a huge achievement to do this. It turns out electrons usually have better things to do than running around in circles all day at close to the speed of light. So it's a huge testament to some of the work that happens at Berkeley Lab that this instrument works as well as it does. So some real diffraction patterns look a little bit like this. Some of these are actually quite famous. And the structure on the far left, for example, is photograph 51, which was used to determine the structure of DNA. So I would be remiss at this point if I don't mention some of the pioneers, the pioneering scientists behind these techniques. There is a proud history in crystallography of women scientists who are all giants in the field and really have made the field what it is today. Kathleen Lonsdale, Dorothy Hodgkin, who won the Nobel Prize, discovered the structure of penicillin, methods developing some of the mathematics that we need to work out where the crystal structures are. This is notable especially because this was at a time when women were especially excluded from scientific spaces. And I wanted to make sure that I mentioned some of these pioneering scientists before I move on. Okay, so diffraction patterns allow us to exactly determine the atoms, the locations of atoms inside crystals. So if we look at a real crystal on the right, this is a bit of iron pyrite or fool's gold. It forms this beautiful cubic crystal. With these diffraction experiments, we might get a pattern like we see in the middle. And then using this fancy mathematics, we can work out the positions of atoms in the crystal. So this works because the symmetry of crystals in the crystal you hold, in the diffraction pattern, and then on the atomic scale are all very, very closely linked to each other. The reason that the crystal you hold in your hand looks like this beautiful cube is because the atoms are arranged in a cubic way. And the arrangement of atoms in a crystal really changes the properties that that crystal has. So if we revisit an earlier example I showed of an LED light bulb, this is something I did my PhD on. It's a good example because LED light bulbs have really contributed to reducing energy usage. They are far more efficient than incandescent bulbs, which I don't recommend you do this, but if you were to put your hand near an incandescent bulb, you would feel how much heat that gives off. That was all wasted energy. In an LED bulb, they give off far less heat and are much, much better for the environment as a result. So inside this LED bulb, we have some crystals, and these crystals are made up of an arrangement of gallium and nitrogen atoms. And then from this crystal structure, we can determine what properties it might have. For example, if you put electricity through it, will it glow? What color will it glow? Is it appropriate for putting in a light bulb, or is it more useful for something else instead? So understanding the arrangements of atoms in crystals allows us to design crystals for specific uses. So these are all the examples I showed of applications of crystals earlier, but now we can see that inside them are all these atomic arrangements that we now understand to be crystal structures. But how do we design new crystals, especially new ones that perhaps don't exist in nature and we can't dig up from the ground? So this is where computers come in. Science is used to problems with lots of data. A huge accomplishment was the Human Genome Project, which tamed the complexity of DNA by achieving the monumental task of recording the complete DNA code of an individual human being, which is a blueprint for understanding how all the cells in our body are made. This photograph is actually showing you what the human genome would look like if you printed it out. It would be 130 books each, all with 4-point font, which is in the background. It's a huge amount of data. But what might a materials genome look like? Can we ask similar questions of, what possible crystal structures can we make? Well, we can, but first we have to think about the recipe for a crystal structure. We have ingredients. These ingredients are elements of the periodic table. And then we have a pattern, which is the symmetrical arrangement of atoms that can carry on forever. And then this gives us the crystal structure with specific useful properties. Well, how many crystal structures can we make? We have 118 elements. And you have multiple elements, different amounts of each element, all in different combinations. There are actually 230 possible patterns. It's an interesting question of why 230, which I can't go into today, but there are 230 possible patterns that crystals can form. If you think about all the combinations of the elements, all the combinations of different patterns, there may be millions of possible crystal structures. And this is where the Materials Project comes in. This is what I work on. So the Materials Project is an online resource that started out at the Materials Genome Initiative in 2011. So we just had our 10th birthday. The aim of the Materials Project is to calculate all properties of all known crystals using supercomputers. So specifically, we have a very large supercomputer here in Berkeley called the NERSC supercomputer, which is used by scientists all over the country. We use it to calculate properties of crystal structures that maybe have never been made before, using quantum mechanics and a lot of advanced software that has been worked on by a lot of people. Importantly, the Materials Project is an open science project. So it's open data, open tools, an open development process when we write the code that supports the Materials Project. And this is all available for free for anybody who wants it. The Materials Project is now used worldwide. It has over 250,000 registered users of scientists and students across academia and industry. It is kind of incredible to me personally that it has grown so much. Just before the pandemic, I don't think we had 100,000 users. The rate is increasing every day, and I'm really very, very proud to be a part of the team behind the Materials Project. So what does a single page from the Materials Genome look like? It looks something like this. This is what you would see if you went to the Materials Project. And you would have a little crystal structure that you could rotate and look at, and also a lot of the properties that we calculate for this crystal structure. How many crystal structures are there? Well, there are a few. They all look very different. They're all very fun. And it doesn't stop there. Actually, in the Materials Project right now, we have a database of about 146,000 crystals. And this is just so far. So every day, we work to add more crystals and more properties to this database. The Materials Project is really a research project. So it is not perfect, it is not complete, but it is something that is getting better every day as we work on it and as we work to improve the data that we serve to our community. Okay, so for the final part of my talk, how do some of these laboratory techniques and computational techniques come together to help us find and make new clean energy solutions? Well, the hope is that computers can help accelerate the process of materials discovery. So the typical process of in the lab of finding a new crystal structure, you have to choose one to make and persuade people that it's worth making. You make that crystal structure, then you find out what you made using diffraction and other techniques, and then you measure the properties of that crystal. And then maybe the properties aren't what you want, and you have to start again. And this really does take decades. So for the LED light bulb that I showed you earlier, that took about 30 years to go from somebody wanting to make the crystal and actually being able to make it reliably and good enough to be a product that could be sold to people or that could be used to reduce energy consumption. So this is a very slow process. And the question is, what can we do to speed it up? If, for example, you start to make a crystal structure, it doesn't have the properties you want, maybe a few years have been wasted that you wouldn't have had to spend if you knew what the properties would have been ahead of time. So this is where the materials project comes in. Because we simulate all of these crystal structures, we share them with the world, you can then search by predicted properties and really select the top candidate crystal structures to make. So it is not going to give you all of the answers, but it is going to shine a little bit of light on the process and maybe just help to streamline this process of new materials discovery. And the important thing to mention here, this is really a collaborative, iterative process. The intention is for computers to help inform experiment, but we have to work very closely between scientists who mainly do computational research, scientists who mainly do experimental research. In order to find these solutions, we really have to work very closely together and collaborate. This kind of science does not work unless you're always talking to people, always finding ways to bring people to the table and communicate your results with each other. Okay, so just to wrap up, material scientists have a role to play in the climate crisis. Crystals are everywhere. They affect all aspects of our lives, and they have useful properties determined by the arrangement of atoms within them. We have powerful tools to understand real crystals in the lab, and the Materials Project is an online encyclopedia of crystals predicted using supercomputers. Combining the lab and the Materials Project, we can then find clean energy solutions to help combat the climate crisis we find ourselves in. Now, of course, the story I've told today is simplified. And when you make real crystal structures, it gets more complicated. And our next speaker is going to talk a little bit about that and some of the crystals that go into a solar panel. So thank you very much for your attention. I'm very, very happy to be able to share this with you today.
Matt, thanks so much. That was a fantastic presentation. I'm just going to ask you one question before we hand it over to Dee to introduce our next speaker. So I'm curious, are X-rays the only way to look at crystals?
No. So the important thing is that you have a wave that is of the right size of the spacing between atoms. So it can be X-rays. It can also be very high energy electrons. So this is something else that we do at Berkeley Lab. There are a lot of scientists in Berkeley Lab working on very powerful electron microscopes that accelerate electrons very fast so that they have the right wavelength and can also generate diffraction patterns and even directly image atoms so that we can see what they look like in a way. It's all very exciting stuff.
That's really great. Thanks so much, Matt. All right, I'm going to ask you to stop sharing your screen and I'm going to hand things over to Dee. And we're looking forward to the next presentation.
Yes, so am I. That was fascinating. Thank you. So I am here to introduce Rachel Woods Robinson. Hello, Rachel. She recently completed her PhD at UC Berkeley, designing new materials that help convert solar energy into electricity that can be sustainably power our world, and is now a postdoc at Berkeley Lab. Congratulations, continuing this work. She's driven by the critical need for renewable energy technology to combat climate change, and also by her fascination with crystals. Her research spans from high throughput calculations of new crystals to experimental solar cell fabrication, which has led her on a fun collaborative adventures with researchers around the world. Sounds exciting. Rachel believes that as a scientist, it's part of our duty to connect with the non-scientific community to establish trust, promote science literacy, and guide scientific work according to community needs and values. As part of efforts to make science more accessible, Rachel has led Cycle for Science, an adventure-based science outreach organization that brings scientists into the classroom to teach interactive lessons about sustainability. Thank you so much. We also share your passion and enthusiasm for bringing science to the community, which is why you are here, Rachel. We're excited to have you, and I will let you take it away.
Thank you so much for the introduction. Can you all hear me okay?
Yep.
Wonderful. So yeah, thank you so much to the team at Science at Cal for organizing this talk and at Berkeley Lab for organizing this. I'm so excited to participate. And yeah, so without further ado, I want to jump into this topic. So we've met some crystals from Matt, and we've learned about how we can analyze crystals. But where are the crystals inside of a solar panel, and what do they do? So I was told to give a Zoom talk today, so I took that literally, and we're going to be zooming in and out of a solar panel. And so to answer some of these questions, we're going to go on a little voyage through space and through time, starting at the sun, and then zooming all the way into the tiny little crystals inside of solar panels. So let's go. All right, so this is an image from NASA of the majestic sun. So we've zoomed to 10 million times larger than the size of a human here. This is our massive solar furnace. And there's about an hour of this footage on YouTube if you want to check it out. It's beautiful. The takeaway here is the sun gives off a lot of different energy in a bunch of different forms of light. And so here's some imagery of the different types of light inside of the sun. And we want to absorb some of these different colors when we are working in a solar panel. And so this is what our solar furnace generator looks like. So today we're going to focus on more what's going on the Earth. And so the sun actually has enough energy to power 1,000 different planet Earths. So here's our Earth to scale. This is just like for a size comparison next to the sun. And let's start by zooming in to the Earth. And now we're about 50 million times bigger than humans. And so here on planet Earth, we have a problem. We learned about some of the challenges facing the planet in Matt's talk. And so here on Earth, we actually don't generate a lot of solar energy yet. And so I'm going to go back in time to about 10 years ago. This is when the Materials project was just getting started. This was also when I was just getting started, getting interested in science. And back then in 2011, only about 0.3% of global electricity actually came from solar power. So after a lot of incredible work from scientists and folks around the globe, we have increased the amount of solar electricity to over about 3%. But this is still quite far from where we need to be in order to start curtailing some of the devastating impacts of climate change. And so how do we get from here to there? All right, so let's start by zooming into the Earth. And I'm going to take you to California, where many of us are today, not all of us. And when you zoom in to California, you can start to see this little gridded area emerge from a satellite view. So this is actually, this is a solar farm, and it's a power plant basically with a bunch of solar panels. And they call it a farm because just like a farm to harvest food, we need a lot of land to harvest solar energy. So for comparison, here is Manhattan. This is about the same thickness as, about the same width as Manhattan. And so right now we're about, we're going to zoom in a little bit more. And right here, we're about 10,000 times bigger than the size of a human. So this particular plant is really interesting. And I'm not going to get into too much detail here, but it's a type of solar panel called thin film solar panels. And there's about 9 million of them here in this solar plant in California. So let's zoom in to the plant a little bit closer. And oh yeah, and here's a football field for scale. So that's about as the size of one of the squares on the plant. All right, so zooming in a little bit closer, we start to see what's called solar arrays. So these are basically strings of solar panels stacked or aligned together in a neatly stacked row. And so if you zoom in to these arrays, then you start to see the individual solar panels. Use my animation delays. All right, here we go. So here's a solar panel. So finally, we are about the size of a human, but not for long. We keep talking about crystals. So where are the actual crystals inside of a solar panel? And what do they do? All right, so an individual solar panel is made up of a bunch of solar cells. So those are the little units inside of the solar panel. And we're going to zoom in again. So what you see going across the solar panel are these little metal strips. And so that's basically how the electricity comes out of the solar panel. But if you take the different layers of the cell and now separate it out, you can see there's a bunch of different layers of this stack. And so you have some glass, you have encapsulation, which basically keeps the solar cell safe. And the actual solar cell itself is only a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of this thickness of the solar panel. And so this is actually where the magic happens. So what we're going to do next is start zooming into the actual solar cell. And for scale, this is actually a picture of a human hair. So this was imaged at Berkeley Lab, or sorry, Lawrence Hall of Science. And so this is, we're getting to about the size of a human hair. It depends on what kind of solar cell you're looking at. But when you zoom in all the way, now you can see this beautiful stack of different crystals inside of a solar cell. So this is a real image taken from an electron microscope, which is what Matt was just describing. It's another way to look at crystals. And so what you can see here is that there are layers and layers and layers inside of the solar cell stacked up together. And I like to think of it kind of like a sloppy layer cake. And so this is a cross section of a solar cell. So we're going to zoom in a little bit more and let's meet the different layers and see what they do. So this layer on the bottom is called the back contact. It basically passes electricity out of the solar cell. Then we have the absorber, and this is kind of what does the heavy lifting. It's the layer that takes in sunlight and converts it to electricity. This is an optional layer called the buffer layer. It kind of just smooths things out and makes charge pass a little bit more smoothly through the whole thing. And then on top, this is a transparent top contact. So its job is basically to let light into the solar cell and then also pass charge out on the top. And this is actually the material that I study in my research. So I like to imagine what it would be like if I shrunk myself down to this scale. So right now we're 10,000 times zoomed in, so 10,000 times smaller than a human. So what if you shrunk yourself to be this tiny little bee and you crawled into a solar cell and you could kind of move around throughout this solar cell and these beautiful crystal layers. So as an analogy, we're going to use this bee to represent an electron in technical jargon. And so my choice of this bee, so electron is negatively charged. And so my choice of this analogy is because if a bee was to charge at you, it would be a pretty negative experience. So this is a bee that represents an electrical worker. Electrons move electricity through crystals. And here's another character in our story. So this is what we call a photon. So it's basically a particle of sunlight that carries a packet of electricity. So when these two interact together, what happens? Inside of a crystal, if the energy from the sun is transferred to an electron, it gets excited and it has more energy. So moving into this crystal layer, we have our sun which shines onto the electron, which gets excited inside of the absorber layer. So now it has enough energy to move basically outside of the crystal through all the different layers of the solar cell and then out into an external circuit where it can then be turned into electricity to power your beautiful iridescent light bulb. And then the electron moves back into the crystal and the process can continue to repeat. And so basically this is how a solar cell works. You have a series of electrons moving through this circuit inside of the different crystal layers. Cool. So one of the challenges we face in our research is how to arrange these layers in a way that maximizes efficiency and minimizes losses. So we're going to take this a little bit further now and imagine you had a crystal knife and you slice the top layer off of this, and we're just going to zoom into the absorber. So if you are to look at the cross section of this absorber layer, what you would see is a bunch of little grains inside of these crystals. And so these are called crystal grains. So to contextualize why this is important, the size, so what Matt mentioned in his talk was about polycrystals. So the size of the grains inside of a particular crystal are going to dictate its properties. So for example, if there's tiny, tiny little crystals, it can take a while for a charge to move through. If the crystals get bigger, they can move faster. And this is what we would call a monocrystal or a single crystal. And so the charge can move even faster through that. So one of the challenges we face in the lab is how to grow high quality crystals with large enough grains for our purposes. So now zooming in a little bit more, we start to see an individual grain. And this is about the scale of the smallest cell bacteria. So we're talking 50,000 times zoomed in. So what do we see here? These are different crystal facets, and you can think of those kind of like the watercolor image of a crystal, or just like here, I have a crystal actually with me now that I grew. So you can see the different facets on these little grains. Whoops, I disappeared. So these are crystalline facets, and the way that we engineer these are also important to the properties inside of a material. All right, so let's zoom in a little bit further, and we're almost at our final stop. But right now, what we see is what's called a grain boundary. And so we're at about 1 million times bigger than the size of a human. This is where 2 grains meet inside of a crystal. So one thing that can happen at grain boundaries is that charges get scattered off, and so it impedes the charge flow, but sometimes you can actually increase your flow of charge along a boundary. So one of the challenges that we are studying as scientists is how to minimize detrimental effects of these grain boundaries and use them to their advantage. All right, so now we can zoom in. This is about 2 million times bigger than your size, and we can finally start to see the individual atoms, which form the pictures that Matt showed in his talk and that are also in my background. And these are this is the crystal structure. And so looking at the same sort of phenomena that we've been talking about is electrons move through this crystal structure, and they can absorb electricity in this absorber material and then start moving out through the crystal into the next layer. All right, so let's contextualize this with materials discovery. This is an example of an absorber layer. This is called cadmium telluride. So there's a couple other materials that are good absorber layers. Silicon is the most common. There's also this crystal called gallium arsenide, and several others that are being developed in the lab. And so the way that the atoms are arranged inside the absorber dictates the properties of whether they will absorb sunlight or not. Here are some examples of common contact layers or buffer layers that are used inside of some of the technologies that we have available today. And then here are some different types of metals inside of solar. So this is just kind of a sample of what goes into your solar panel. We can sort the elements here are the elements that we have inside of the solar panels from the periodic table. And we can sort them into some categories now. So we have elements that are earth abundant, that there are a lot of these elements present on Earth. Some of these are kind of toxic, which can be problematic. Some of them are very expensive, and then some of them are critical, which basically means they're very difficult to extract, and there's a lot of issues associated with their extraction from the Earth's crust. So one challenge that we want to work on moving forward is how do we make new crystals for solar using earth abundant materials and minimizing the harm that we cause to the planet in making these solar panels. And so to do this, here's where we turn back to the materials project. This is another sort of sampling of some crystals. There's a lot more, but here are some of the earth abundant crystals that Materials Discovery using Materials Project and some other projects and other databases have resulted in. So these are things that scientists right now are studying in the lab to really try to understand whether they would make good new materials for solar absorbers and for contacts. And so this is some exciting research that's going on. And I would, if you're interested, I can talk more about this in the Q&A. I should say these crystal structures were generated via some software that Matt, our previous speaker, has written. And I just think they're beautiful. All right, so we've zoomed into a crystal all the way to see the atoms. And now let's zoom back out, back to the grains and back to the different layers and back to the cell. And the way that we do materials discovery in the lab, we often just think about, let's make something that works well. We're scientists, we're gonna do that. And we don't really need to think about how it applies to the bigger picture. But I think it's really important to contextualize our research and to think about, where it comes from and how can we do it better. So here let's go back to this picture of the common elements inside of solar panels. Where do they come from? So this is a map of critical solar materials, which is basically, it shows those elements that I described that were sort of distributed unevenly around the earth or have challenges associated with extracting them. And so, for example, 40% of the world's tellurium is used in solar panels, and that is a problem. It's a very, very rare and non-abundant element. And there's also a lot of geopolitical issues involved with mining. And so we need to really think about where our materials come from when we do materials discovery. So here's sort of the map expanded to renewable energy materials in general, so including batteries and wind turbines and the electrical grid. So like I said before, a lot of what we think about when we're making materials is the product design and manufacturing, but really those are just two pieces of this this bigger picture. And so this is called often framed as the circular economy. And so one challenge we face as scientists moving forward is how do we design new materials really considering their full life cycle and the impact of these materials on the world. So I'm going to zoom into one sort of special or one section of this this picture. So recycling. So we actually I think this is from a couple of years ago, but about 90% of solar panels go straight to the landfill after they die. And this is a big problem. And the reason for this is right now, recycling is just way more expensive than sending solar panels to the landfill. And so this is a really big challenge right now, is figuring out how can we actually recycle solar panels and renewable energy materials so they don't continue to contribute to devastation of ecosystems in the planet. And then sort of to conclude, I wanted to mention these challenges span far beyond tech and economics. And so, for example, here is an image taken by J. Henry Fair of a aluminum facility in Louisiana. And so aluminum is actually an earth abundant material, but there's still issues associated with extracting this material from the earth. And as you can see here, there's this children's play area right next to this facility, which releases lead and mercury. And so if we zoom in a little bit, there's I would recommend checking out this project. There's some really sort of devastating images of industrial scars on the earth. And so I wanted to mention green sacrifice zones, which our communities are hotspots of chemical pollutions where residents live immediately adjacent to heavily polluted industries or military bases. And so this presents a human challenge for scientists. For a truly just energy transition, we really need to start designing materials and thinking about how can we prioritize human rights and seek to minimize harm and exploitation as we do our science. So to conclude, here is our solar tour in review. We started at the sun and we zoomed into solar panels and solar cells all the way down to the atomic scale. And I just want to end by with a call to action. So there's a lot of challenges that we face in combating climate change, and sometimes it feels really overwhelming and we're not sure what we can do. But just like solar, there's really small things that are going on inside of solar panels that have a huge impact on the bigger picture. And so I like to think of our roles as humans in the climate crisis, kind of like the roles of atoms in a solar panel. There's little small actions that we can each take that make a big impact. So my challenge is, what small action can you take in your life right now that can scale up and help build a more just and sustainable world? So thank you so much for joining me, and happy to take any questions. And thank you so much for organizing this talk.
Thank you, Rachel. That was so wonderful. It's so exciting to hear about how solar panels work, because I know we know that they work, but how do they work? So it's exciting to hear stuff that we're all very much familiar with and learning about how they function and how crystals play a role. They're so beautiful. So one of the things I wanted to ask you is, why are some crystals good at absorbing sunlight, but others are not? You know, how does things like the material discovery process that Matt talked about design good absorbable crystals?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I guess I didn't really get into the depths of that. So let's see, I have a slide. No, I'm not going to share a slide. So basically, the way that like Matt was saying, the way that atoms are arranged inside of a crystal can really dictate its properties. And so in this case, the property that you want inside of an absorber is to be able to take in sunlight and convert it to electricity. And one mental model of how this works is that a crystal basically has electrons sloshing around inside of it. And so you want to design a crystal such that the electrons will sort of interact with the light in a way that keeps it in the crystal, rather than reflecting it or rather than passing it through. So we do this using basically quantum calculations of crystals to get a sense of like how the light and the electricity and the atoms interact with each other. And this is one of the advantages of this big materials database, is you can go through, there's already calculations on the materials project that show some of the energy levels inside of the crystals and how that might impact the way that light interacts with them. So yeah, that's kind of a basic answer to that question. You can filter which crystals are more likely to have light come to absorb light than others.
Got it. And then, you showed us your beautiful crystals that you grew at home, and Elise added some links to some crystal growing kits in the chat. But how are crystals grown in the lab for solar panels? Oh, you're disappeared again. There you are. There it is.
How are they? Oh yeah. Okay. So I actually have a video I can share. Should I do that?
Yeah, let's go for it. Love animation.
This is from YouTube, and I should properly credit it, but
we can share a link to it in the chat as well.
Okay. So this is one example of how you grow a crystal in a lab. So this is a process that's called spin coating. And so basically you drop a solution, and this is how you grow like a really thin layer of crystals, which is what is used in solar panels. So you drop, you basically want to have a bunch of atoms come to the surface and then form in their crystalline way. And so one way to do this is is via this like chemical solution. Other ways to do it, which is what I've done in my experience, is using basically like a plasma source or a laser to use really high energy and basically smash atoms and particles on the surface of a piece of glass or a solar cell, and make like a thin surface of atoms on the layer of glass, and then you can take it to the lab and go test it.
Very cool. Yeah, that's neat. I'm going to go ahead and invite Matthew and Jen back to have a larger Q&A. We have lots of questions coming into the chat, and please, folks watching and listening, please remember you can always use that Q&A function and the chat function to do that. So I'm going to hand things over to Jen so we can start our group conversation.
Sounds good. So that was actually a fascinating video, Rachel, to see how crystals are grown in the lab. So let me ask maybe both you and Matt, you know, some crystals, as you both talked about, appear naturally in the earth, while others can only be made in the lab. So can you talk about why that is? And then a couple follow-up questions to that are, you know, what are some of the raw materials that you would need to make crystals? And is it easy to make them? Is it hard to make them? You know, just talk us through the process of making crystals.
If it's okay, I'll take the first one, Rachel, then I'll hand it to you for the second. All right. I think it's actually kind of cool to ask the question, why do certain crystals exist in the ground? You can dig them up, and other ones we have to make in the lab. And it's really actually because we live on Earth. Earth has a lot of oxygen in the atmosphere. The oxygen comes as a result of a lot of life on Earth. So really, the crystals that we see on Earth are, in a way, a complete happenstance because we live on a planet that is rich with life. If we were on a different planet, maybe we could dig up other crystals that on Earth we can only make in the lab. So that was an excellent question. Thank you. Rachel?
I guess to add to that, one of the sort of advantages of starting to grow new crystals is you can go beyond the constraints on planet Earth in terms of like on Earth you can grow mostly like oxygen-based crystals, but in the lab you can change the atmosphere in which you're growing your crystal such that you can tailor the growth atmosphere to whatever you want to make. And it's a really fascinating challenge a lot of scientists are working on is, one, how can we predict whether a predicted crystal will actually be able to be synthesized in the lab? And then if so, what are some conditions that we can use in our synthesis to make that possible? And so there's some fascinating research actually here at Berkeley Lab, trying to come up with come up with a recipe for a given crystal. So take a crystal from the Materials Project. What's like a 5-step recipe that can get you this crystal? And it's really exciting. We're basically still figuring out how all of this works.
Got it. Thanks both. So there is a biologist and mathematician in our audience today, and they noticed that crystalline engineering made by biological processes are unique and valuable. So the question they had is, how advanced is materials engineering? You know, are the mat engineers using biology to make things like crack-resistant ceramics or, you know, sensor devices, for example?
Sorry. Do you want to take that, Rachel?
I was just gonna say that like this is kind of beyond my level of expertise. I think there's a lot of really interesting like bio-inspired materials discovery going on, and if anything, it's I always think biology is so complicated, and that we have these simple models that work for materials science, and like we are slowly learning from biologists how to incorporate some of these beautiful things that living creatures do and incorporate them synergistically into how we design materials. Do you know of any examples, Matt, of some bio-inspired?
Not off the top of my head, but I would say, I think on a meta level, taking inspiration from different fields of science, I think it shows scientists are talking to each other across fields is really crucial, because even though this field has been around for maybe 100 years, a couple of hundred years, depending how you define it, I really feel like we're still at the start. You know, a lot of the crystal structures we make are very difficult to make and ultimately are quite simple. And some people think of much, much more complicated crystal structures that have these amazing properties, and we just do not know how to make them yet. And taking inspiration from biology and from other fields, I think is really important to be able to do that into the future.
One thing to add, I maybe should mention there's a lot of research going on into basically artificial photosynthesis, which is another way of absorbing sunlight. So this is sort of inspired by the processes that go on in plants. Plants convert sunlight into electricity. They've been doing it since before we've existed. And so there's a lot we can learn from the way that plants work. And there's lots of really cool research we didn't get into today into converting sunlight into not just electricity, but also fuels and different chemicals to use.
Got it. So, well, actually, speaking of plants, we've got a question that Dee is going to pose for the group.
Well, I just wanted, you were kind of hanging out around one of our questions, and I'm not sure if you saw that question in the chat, but it actually asked about plants because, of course, chlorophyll is such an efficient, it converts light to energy so efficiently. And the question was about how energy efficient solar cells are compared to biological cells. So if we had to say, you know, it's X percentage efficient, do solar cells compare to how efficient chlorophyll is in utilizing sunlight for energy? And you cannot know the answer, that's fine.
I will say I don't know the answer. So
I know that I don't know the number, but and if someone in the chat knows, please feel free to share. But plants are actually extremely inefficient. So it all depends on how you define efficiency, but efficiency is usually defined as what percentage of all of the energy coming in actually comes out as a useful product. And so plants are actually inefficient in terms of the percentage is quite lower than that of our solar panels. But because they're so good at it, they do it all the time. There's so much sunlight, you don't really need to be very efficient if you're a plant. You just need to get your fuel, and it doesn't matter if it's 1% or 40%. So then looking back to solar panels, though, it's really important because we use so much the surface of the land that we need to convert energy into sunlight. We can't cover our entire planet with solar panels. That would be a problem. But if the more efficient a solar panel is, the less space it needs to take up. And so, so it's kind of more for the human purposes, it's a little bit more important to have a highly efficient solar panel. Does that make sense?
That does. And actually that's really, really fascinating. And say their inefficiency is actually something I hadn't thought about. It's just about they're everywhere, sun's everywhere, and they're only using the light that they need to grow. So that was interesting. Thank you. I will hand things back to Jen. Or Jen, do you want me to take on another question?
Either way, if you've got one queued up.
Yeah. I do. The popular science press has recently highlighted the great potential of various barium-based materials. Are these earth abundant? Are they toxic? Were computers used to focus attention on these new barium materials? So questions about that, if you're familiar with that material, Rachel or Matthew.
I don't know a lot about barium-containing materials. I know they're used for fireworks, and I know they can be pretty toxic and pretty bad. But so I'm not aware of for technological materials.
Okay.
So I'll just add, barium is technically earth abundant. I'm also not aware of some of the challenges associated with mining. And so this is another example of how, as a scientist, there's a lot I need to learn about where materials come from. The one example that I can think of right now is barium zirconium sulfide is a material I showed on one of my slides that is being researched right now in the lab. And so there's also some transparent conductors that contain barium. But
there is barium titanate as well, which is an interesting material, I think, for scientific purposes. Sometimes materials are interesting because They allow us to answer questions about physics by studying them, and some materials are interesting because they're actually going to be used in devices. But barium titanate is not a material I am familiar with, but it is both interesting because of the physics. I think maybe it's used in a lot of places as well. Somebody will probably tell me afterwards.
We should mention too, barium is also used in rat poison, and so there's a lot of toxicity concerns associated with many of the elements, and we have to keep that in mind when we're designing materials that will be used in ecosystems near humans.
Got it. Well, then you guys answered every question that was posed, so thank you for that. And I know you had talked about that you had shown that map of the corresponding different materials and where they are. The question specifically, are those countries where the materials are naturally located on Earth, or are those just the countries that have the mining industries for those materials specifically?
That's a great question. I believe it's where the mining is currently located, and so that map is generated from like those are places where a particular material is concentrated at a certain percentage, like a really high percentage. I think it's from mining, but I would like to be fact checked.
Okay, perfect. Thanks.
So
could I? Oh, I apologize.
Yeah, no, go for it, Matt.
Could I add like a small addendum to the previous question, which is, I just want to say that because there are all these crystal structures, you know, the 140,000 materials project, whatever it may be, it is really the case that some people can spend an entire career just studying a particular kind of crystal, and there are going to be experts in all of these all over the world. And I mentioned that in the context of barium, but I think it's true with all these other kinds of materials. It really is a very, very big field, and there's a lot of depth to it, a lot that we can learn about each individual crystal structure. Yeah,
and just to add to that, I should mention, like, we all come with biases in our research based on sort of what we've understood in our past, what we've researched, and both Matt and I are kind of more generalists at the moment in our research. We look at a bunch of different crystals, but that can come at the expense of knowing some really specific things about, you know, where barium comes from, for example.
Love it. You know, I was going to ask a different question, but I feel like, you know, no pun intended, the chemistry between you two is great. And that's probably because it sounds like your lab mates at the Materials Project or worked together in the past. So, you know, we often have folks who tune in who are students. Can you each talk really briefly about how you ended up in this field and what somebody who's interested in being a materials scientist might want to study if they're interested in pursuing a similar career?
Sure. I'll go first. So yeah, how I ended up in this field, for me personally, it was an extremely circuitous adventure to get here. I was pretty sure I was going to be a musician for the first 20 years of my life. And so I ended up in materials science because basically two reasons. One, I thought crystals were just really cool. And then two, I was really driven to look for technical solutions to climate change. And so when I found out that you can use crystals to study climate change and make solutions, I just thought that was the coolest thing ever. And so how I ended up getting into the specific field that I work in, which is the transparent top layer to solar panels, that was kind of arbitrary. I thought it was a really fascinating problem because most materials are either transparent to light or they conduct electricity. And the challenge of my research is looking for these sort of rare exceptions to materials that both conduct electricity and let light through. And I just thought that was a really fascinating problem. And so in terms of what others can study if they're interested in material science, there's so many cool things to learn and so many fascinating challenges that combine. This was just a little subsection of what you could study as a material scientist. There's a lot of cool work in batteries. There's like materials for wind turbines. There's sort of, and there's more technological challenges besides just crystals too. There's a lot of engineering challenges to clean energy. Like, how do we make sure that the grid can handle solar panels, and how do we make sure that electricity can get to everybody who needs it? And so anyway, that was kind of a tangent, but I'll let Matt share his adventures.
It was an interesting tangent. On a personal note, I really have my parents to thank for getting me into science. My dad was always getting copies of popular science magazines. My mother would take me to museums, and I would see these crystal structures, and they are beautiful. They really captivate you. But then, honestly, as a kid, I was really interested. I kind of forgot about it for a while. I was into, animals, astronomy, other things. But I started to get interested again when I was in university, and it's really about the symmetry of these crystals. The symmetry is so interesting and interacts with the physics in such a profound way. There's a quotation I really like from a scientist, Colin Humphreys, who says that crystals are like people. It's the defects that make them interesting. And I did my graduate school studies was on defects in crystal structures and the ways that, the light, if they glow, the color of the light changes because of these defects in the symmetry of the crystal structure. And it really is just such a fascinating thing. If anybody's interested in getting started with material science, there really is no wrong way to do it, because it is a field that intersects chemistry, physics, mathematics, depending on what areas you're doing, chemical engineering, biology. I work with colleagues from very, very, very different backgrounds. If you're interested in science, just keep being curious, and yeah, there's a way in. I'm not sure if I can say that in a better way, but yeah.
Those are both great. There's lots of folks in the audience who are interested about crystals, myself included. So somebody asked, where are we right now? And what's the vision for this field? And, if people wanted to learn about the history of crystals and materials research, are there any books that you might recommend that we could drop into the chat for folks or follow up with folks later?
I'll just mention very quickly, the Royal Institution in the UK has a wonderful YouTube channel, and they really put a lot of thought into their content, and they have a deep back catalog as well. So the father-son team I showed in my slides of Lawrence and William Bragg, who invented that diffractometer. William Bragg, I'm sorry, sometimes I get them mixed up. William Bragg was an excellent science communicator. He was really a pioneer in talking about science to the general public. And we give Christmas lectures talking about crystals and also lots of other things to a general audience. And they're really fantastic lectures, and they're a lot of fun. So I would recommend that as a place to start. Rachel?
Yeah, I agree completely. I spent a good amount of time during the lockdown just watching the Royal Institution's Christmas lectures from through the years, and they're so well done. It's really good science communication. Part of that question was the vision for the future, and so crystals, what's their role in the future? I mean, I think there's a lot of like sort of what we touched on. The next step in materials discovery for the future is looking at this full life cycle of crystals, where they come from, how they're used, where they go after the technology maybe breaks down or needs to get reused and stuff. And so I think if you're sort of interested in the vision for the future, I would check out some of the research on the circular economy and how that applies to materials discovery. There's a lot that we have to learn in that area. And one thing I want to mention too, I showed like a picture of a solar cell dying in a field. There's some really fascinating research on how we can recycle and reuse the materials in solar panels. So basically break down the cells and then extract the elements and use them again. And so I think that's one of the biggest next steps, is just like, how do we reduce harm and use materials in a really thoughtful way during the process.
Well, that's a great segue because once again, you started answering a question that was in the chat. So I'm going to just go ahead and give you the full question. So maybe you can expand. So the question was, the cost to recycle panels is high compared to sending them to the landfill, but how does the cost of material recovered by recycling affect the cost of making the new material or the new panels, excuse me? So that's the first question. Isn't recovered material a lot less expensive than mining new materials? And if so, could that savings be reflected in the disposal costs? So I will let you answer that chunk if you can, if you would kindly do so.
Those are really wonderful questions. I will do my best, but I'm rather lacking in the economic department. So yeah, my basic answer is that it's that's going to fluctuate over time. Like it depends on which technology you're talking about as well. So like silicon is really cheap to pull out of the ground, and there's not a lot of, like 90% of solar panels are made from silicon right now, and that's one of the crystals I showed as an absorber. And there's less incentive right now to recycle silicon solar panels. I'm not sure exactly how the economics work out in terms of like how expensive it is to reuse, but people are starting to work on that. The other type of material I was talking about, cadmium telluride, it's actually really important to recycle them. And right now, a lot of cadmium telluride solar panels are recycled because of one of the statistics I shared, that like this material uses about 40% of the world's tellurium. There's not enough tellurium in the world to keep digging it up and making solar panels. So part of the business model of the companies that make cadmium telluride solar panels is you have to recycle it for the solar panel to work. And so this is going to change over time depending on which new technologies come online. And I'm sure there's a lot of experts out there that know more than me about this, but yeah, it's a great question. Yeah,
very fascinating. So in a lot of those answers, the response is sort of, it depends, right? With time and the materials and the company and the crystal. And so thank you.
So I think actually Matt was going to chime in.
Oh, great. Yeah, go ahead.
I can make it very quick.
No, go for it.
Just on that note, I mean, it's not about solar, but there's a lot of talk about lithium in batteries, right? Because and why are we not recycling batteries more? It's also very expensive to recycle batteries compared to getting lithium out of the ground. There's lithium everywhere, right? But it's difficult to get it into a form that's useful for battery manufacturing, and that's kind of why recycling is difficult. But I think the important thing to mention is a lot of the costs are externalized. So the reason that recycling is more expensive than digging up more lithium is often because digging up lithium has a lot of negative externalities on the environment or on people who live near those mines, and that's not taken into account in the cost of the lithium. So if we had a more fair sort of representation of the true cost to the planet and to people of mining versus recycling things that we had already mined, the economics might actually be a little bit different.
Perfect. I'm glad that you stopped us to say that, because that's a consideration that definitely needs to be heard. So in terms of the shelf life, because there's a whole set of questions around a bit around sustainability of the panels themselves. So what's the shelf life typically? How can we make them last longer? And I know that there are other challenges that affect solar cells that don't have anything to do with the crystals, right? And how effective they are, and again, their lifespan. So can you chat about that, Rachel?
Yes, I will try my best. So I believe that most solar panels are, like, when you buy them, they're usually, what's the word? They usually are expected to last about 25 years. That's what their warranty is. The problem is that over time, the performance tends to go down of solar panels, and there's a lot of incentives now to sort of get them replaced, which then can lead to higher efficiency in your panels, but then it also can lead to an increased amount of waste. Sorry, can you remind me of the second part of the question?
other challenges affecting solar cells,
Oh, yeah.
not just their effectiveness, but also their lifespan. Yeah.
Yeah. So one thing, so scientists like to share their nice shiny results in the lab and say like, hi, I made a extremely efficient solar panel. We also need to be better about doing our due diligence of measuring, will this actually function over the amount of time that we need it to function for? And that's one of the challenges with some of the new materials that we're working with. Maybe we have a high performance cell in the lab, but we don't really know what it's going to look like after 20, 25 years for a technology that we developed this past year. There's attempts, so there's sort of accelerated life cycle testing, I believe it's called, where you basically like shine lots and lots of light on the solar panel to sort of simulate what would happen to it over a large amount of time. There's also some really fun sort of research projects where you take a solar panel, and I know this is what they do at the National Renewable Energy Lab, where I did some of my research in my PhD. You take a solar panel, you put it outside, you basically like smash it. You do everything you can do to it to simulate what could happen, you know, during a hailstorm, during a thunderstorm. You bash it to pieces and you see how that affects performance. And so that's one way that you can sort of research what will happen over the long term. Another challenge I just want to mention, because it's funny, but also it's a real challenge, is like when you have a bunch of solar panels out in the field, sometimes, you know, passerbyers such as birds can leave part of their previous meal on the solar panel, and there's actually a problem because sometimes bird droppings will actually leach into the solar panels and cause degradation. And so there's a lot of challenges outside of the actual like atomic scale. What happens practically when you put solar in the field that can lead to its degradation.
So Rachel, I think that was the nicest way I've ever heard anybody refer to bird poop. So we've got a couple more questions for you, and then we'll wrap up around 1:30. So Matt, you'd mentioned the materials project, sort of accelerating the discovery of new materials, but have any new materials actually been made as a result of the materials project database?
The short answer is yes, but this is obviously an ongoing process because we're a research project. So the general process that I described in the talk of searching for the properties you want and then trying to make them can take a few years, but people have looked at materials from Materials Project for all kinds of things, from new batteries, carbon capture materials, new phosphors, which are just materials that glow when you shine light on them, thermoelectrics, which are materials that can be used for cooling. Something I looked at myself was magnetocaloric materials, which are kind of magnets that can cool down when I'm trying to think how to describe it. They're magnets that can be used for cooling. So instead of your refrigerator, which is pretty loud, has all these sort of very nasty CFC gases in it that are bad for the environment, you could instead imagine a refrigerator powered by magnets. You know, all the cooling fluid instead of those gases would just be water, and it would also be more efficient, and it'd be quieter as well. So, you know, there are some really interesting materials out there. The magnetocalorics I mentioned, there are a few magnetocalorics that are known, but the hope or the idea is that there are a lot more magnetocalorics that are not known. And we proposed one, and a colleague, Professor Joy Cooley, who's now at Fullerton, synthesized and looked at some of those at the University of California at Santa Barbara. And they had the response that we predicted, which is always a lovely thing, because sometimes we predict things on the computer and then they don't actually have the properties that we expected them to have. So it's always very validating when some of those predictions are reliable, and that can inform our future studies and our future work. But it is a big process and there is a lot left to do.
Got it. So we just had one more question come into the chat. We could be here for another 30 minutes. So I'll just ask this one and then maybe we can wrap up. So is it possible to crystallize captured carbon and use it to integrate in usable materials?
I think for that, I might just say that we have a lot of carbon in the world, so we don't really have to worry about what we're doing with the carbon as long as it's being captured. Capturing the carbon, I think, is the most important part of that question, and hopefully we're finding more ways to do that.
And I want to mention, I cannot remember the name of this company, but there is a company, there are scientists working on basically that same question, which is how do you crystallize carbon from the air and store it somewhere and take it out of the air? It's a really exciting field of research. I should say where it is right now, it uses a lot of energy to do that crystallization. So one thing we have to think about as scientists is like our processes to grow crystals can be really, really energy intensive and use a lot of CO2. Our supercomputers can use a lot of CO2. It takes a lot of energy to cool them. And so I think as scientists, part of our duty is to be mindful of how we use our own resources in trying to solve these challenges to combat climate change. But this is also, like we were saying, this, as there's more renewable electricity on the grid, we can get away with using more electricity from the grid because it's going to be less carbon intensive. And so I don't know, I would encourage you, if you're interested in that, to look up some of that research. I can't speak to the specifics, but it's really exciting.
That's awesome. So I know I keep saying last question. I'm going to ask this last question.
Here you are.
Because I'm curious to know the answer to this. Have crystals been grown in space? And if so, are they different from the crystals that have been grown on Earth? And yeah, so I see you nodding. Tell us more about crystals in space.
Yes, they have. I'm not super familiar with the processes that happen, but obviously when you do not have gravity to get in the way, different kinds of crystallization are good. If you're ever making crystals at home, the key to making a good crystal is to do it slowly and to let that crystal grow really slowly. And in space, I am aware that, for example, insulin crystals have been grown. So, a lot of biological molecules, in order to really understand what they are, you have to first make a crystal. And I know that insulin crystals have been grown in space, and they look beautiful and they're really big. I don't know any more than that, though. Rachel?
I'll just add a little bit to that. So like what Matt was saying, and I think I mentioned this earlier, but I might not have explained it very clearly. Some of the techniques that we use in the lab actually try to mimic the conditions in space because space is like very, very high vacuum. There's not a lot of like stuff colliding in the atmosphere. One of the challenges on Earth growing crystals is that it's really mucky and there's a lot of stuff going on. There's a lot of oxygen particles bouncing around, and the problem there is that we don't actually some of the crystals are not very high quality because of that challenge. And so when I work in the lab, I try to mimic the conditions of space to basically have a high vacuum so that we can make really clean crystals. So I know there's I think they've grown crystals on the International Space Station and like tried to make them high quality in a high vacuum environment. So yes, crystals can be grown in space. Again, we have the challenge of like, where do we get the energy from to grow the crystal? Yes, Matt?
I just have such an interesting addition to this that I really want to say it, so thank you. So space also grows crystals itself, right? So, one of the most beautiful crystals that I really like in iron nickel meteorites, it's something called Wittgenstein microstructure. Sometimes people make it into jewelry, so they polish it, and it just looks absolutely beautiful. So space itself is making crystals in space. I think I saw something, I'm not an expert in this, so I can't say this is 100% true, but that there are giant diamonds floating in space somewhere. But I would believe it. I would believe it. Nature is making crystals all the time in space as well as they are on Earth.
They've been making it for a lot longer than we have.
That's fascinating. Thank you, Donata, for asking that question, because that was just fascinating to hear you both talk about crystals in space. So as we are wrapping up, thank you so much to you both again for fantastic presentations and for the questions that we got from the audience. Loved them all. You'll see that Dee has a slide up. We'd love to know what you think of our events. So take a look at that QR code, take a snap. We'd love for you to fill out our survey. And as always, you can stay up to date with us lbl.gov, and science@cal.berkeley.edu is where you can learn about our research. Hopefully we'll see you for our fall slate of Midday Science Cafe lectures. I'll say thanks. Dee, anything you want to add to that before we sign off?
You know, I just wanted to add that there were so many comments in the chat just saying how grateful and thankful that you both were such fabulous science communicators. So we want to thank you for all the hard work that you put in, and for the audience for being so engaging once again. So thank you again.
Thank you guys so much. I just want to add really quick, if anyone has questions that weren't answered, feel free to email me. I'm sure Matt would be available for that as well. And yeah, or any comments on the talks, or there's a lot that me and Matt have to learn as scientists. So we would love to learn from you as well.
Love that. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.